Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is Michael Tracey. Michael, could you introduce yourself?
Hello there, Blogging Heads universe. I am Michael Tracey, journalist. Was up until a week or two ago officially a journalist with the Young Turks Network, and am now in the process of coming up with another journalistic route that I will pursue, and the details of which are a little premature to divulge publicly, but there are things in the works. So,
I didn't realize you weren't with the Young Turks anymore. Okay, well, we'll stay tuned to see where you land. So thanks for coming on today. You've been on Blogging Heads a couple times before. Probably most people are familiar with you. I'd say that the perspective you embody is kind of leftish, kind of skepticism of a lot of the liberal narrative regarding what's happening in the country, especially the Trump administration and the Russia story. Would you say that's accurate?
I wouldn't object to that characterization necessarily. I think that's a roughly accurate. Since the beginning of Trump's candidacy, actually, I think one of the main features of how it's been perceived is basically a contradictory liberal portrayal of Trump. And one of the big manifestations of that, obviously, is the Russia story because it's so dominant, but it also extends into other areas. So, and those contradictions have been apparent to me over time, to the point that I normally feel impelled to point them out, which can tend to make people angry. But anyway, yeah, so I think the characterization is roughly accurate.
So what would you say are those contradictions in the liberal narrative?
Well, I mean, thinking back now, going to the campaign, there was this narrative that Trump was a fascist menace unlike anything ever before seen in American politics, and therefore all the stops had to be pulled out to prevent him from seizing power, or so you would think, because what liberals tend to do is they've amped up the rhetorical flourishes to describe Trump, and yet their actual conduct doesn't seem to accord with those rhetorical flourishes. So think back, to the spring of 2016, for example. There was this talk that Trump was a legitimate threat to the world order, and I guess sort of now that line has continued. But if you really believe that Trump was so dangerous that he could obliterate all of humankind, then it was probably incumbent on you to take steps beyond angrily tweeting and maybe organizing in swing states for the Democratic presidential candidate. You had to do some things that actually, I don't know, could incur some physical risk. That's what the resistance did in, say, occupied France, or the resistance did in other places that were under fascist tyranny. Mm-hmm. And yet there always seemed to be a distance between how liberals were describing Trump in terms of their rhetoric and what they were willing to do in practice. And to me, that called into question whether or not they actually believe their rhetoric. And there's something similar going on now. I mean, you have the dominant narrative being that Trump has committed literal treason, which is probably the most extreme allegation that you can level at any president. I mean, if not the most, it's one of the most extreme. I mean, it would have been unfathomable not too long ago. And yet you don't see Democrats and their kind of liberal abettors in the media behaving as though that set of extreme circumstances is actually upon us. It's what they seem to be doing is evidenced almost entirely by the manner in which they've scaled up the tone of their rhetoric, rather than any kind of tangible action which would seem to substantiate the fears that they've been expounding. So that to me, I think, is my guiding premise in analyzing a lot of what Trump does. Separate the rhetoric of both Trump himself and his supporters from action, and also Trump's opponents and their action. And you can thereby see many contradictions that tend to get buried under the hyperbole and the rhetoric, which I think is at a level now that's sort of unprecedented in terms of its extremism.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I'd respond by saying there's rhetoric that is very, very extreme, coming from both kind of mainstream type figures. John Brennan, I think, is the one who tweeted that after Trump's press conference with Putin that he's a traitor, this is treason. And then you have kind of just like the social media exaggeration that people do because it helps them get lots of attention and retweets of the kind of like the Krasenstein brothers, or however you pronounce their last name, where it's just like always, everything is always at like hyped up to 11, and the thread is always like, we're at 1 minute from midnight. So I acknowledge that.
I love those guys, by the way.
Yeah, did you see the article about them and how kind of they have kind of a semi-shady past involving like Florida real estate and?
Yeah, I mean, more power to them, though. I mean, if you can convert your slightly dubious liaison with law enforcement into a bizarrely massive social media presence, and I have to just respect the hustle.
Yeah, they're talented, and I mean, there's been an emergence of some of the kind of hucksters on the left that have long been on the right. The Krasensteins, Louise Mensch, Eric Garland, that guy who I think is mentally ill. But there's not like a Dinesh D'Souza type figure exactly, or like the big kind of prominent people who are clearly like doing huckster type things to like make money.
If Eric Garland and Louise Mensch were to collaborate on a documentary film, which was playing in theaters nationwide, and then were invited on, to MSNBC every couple of days, and then wrote like 6 best-selling books in a row, then they would rise to Dinesh D'Souza levels, and I guess they'd have to get like involved in some kind of criminal activity and then be pardoned.
Right. Yeah. So there's still like 10 times as many like talented con men and hucksters on the right as there are on the left right now. I don't think Trump is a fascist because I don't think he truly has an ideology, and you have to believe in some things to be a fascist. When it comes to like what the resistance is doing versus what their rhetoric would imply they should be doing, I mean, what would you want them to be doing? Like political violence is not going to solve anything. It would only lead to a backlash that would support the people in power. We have students doing, like die-in events at their congressmen's offices. So they're putting their bodies down on the ground to protest. We've had massive rallies. We've had people who have never been involved in politics before deciding to run for their state legislature or for Congress. There's people like Ocasio-Cortez, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who have come out to put themselves forward for office. So there's been people are sticking within democratic lines. Like democracy has not been eliminated like it was in Vichy France. We don't, the resistance maybe has, it's high blown rhetoric, but no one is like living underground or smuggling weapons. But people are still working within the democratic means because Trump is not a fascist authoritarian. He has not canceled elections. He has not ignored a Supreme Court order or anything like that. He has not provoked an actual constitutional crisis yet. It may still be in the offing, but we don't know yet. So that would be my kind of defense of the resistance.
Well, I mean, I think the high-blown rhetoric can be attributed in part to the social media excesses, which is just an ingrained feature of how those online networks operate, and there's nothing you can do to change it, and you have to kind of accept that as what those networks are kind of designed to encourage and what they reward. But at the same time, I mean, I think at this point, you can't fully separate social media from ordinary politics. Every single politician is involved in social media to some extent at this point. The president uses social media as his main, bullhorn.
Right.
So I think the kind of tropes that originate in social media pretty reliably end up trickling into just kind of mainstream political discussion, if only because every cable news producer basically spends all day sitting on Twitter and booking their shows based on like what the trending topics are.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of inseparable at this phenomenon at this point. And the social media originated portrayal of Trump has almost morphed into what the mainstream Democratic view of Trump is in terms of the rhetoric that they employ. So that's an issue because it tends to inform their analysis of the current political circumstances in a way that I think is very often flawed. So you said before that you don't think Trump's a fascist. That would put you apart from lots of the leading opinion makers in the United States who use that presumption as the kind of guiding theory of how they are describing present political conditions. Mm-hmm. So that's a big distinction. I mean, if you think he's a fascist versus if you don't, is not just kind of like some trivial consideration. It's actually a fundamental departure in how you view the current political landscape. So considering that, based on their rhetoric, lots of people in the Democratic Party and in the media and in the various elite classes do feel as though he's a fascist. You're bringing about a incomplete and often inaccurate assessment of present political dynamics. One of the big manifestations of that is this belief that what we're undergoing now is not normal. So that's the mantra, that's the chant. That's been what you have been supposed to line up and proclaim since the election. This is not normal. You're supposed to like drone it as if you're in church reciting hymns or something. Mm-hmm. But a lot of what people ascribe to abnormality actually tends to be quite normal, and they don't want to believe that it's normal because that detracts from the overriding thesis that Trump constitutes an aberrational imposition on the American people, probably with the help of a hostile foreign power. So they want to delegitimize what Trump represents as a duly elected president, because they don't want to believe that he's duly elected, because that would mean that they have to kind of reorient their political perspectives to account for that reality. You actually, just as a side note, you see something very similar happening now with Brexit. A lot of so Britain always kind of follows America's lead in the most sinister possible ways. So they don't actually import a lot of what's good about America, but they like mimic what's bad. So now you have like a lagging indicator in Britain where the kind of prevailing view in liberal media circles and among large factions of the anti-Brexit contingency is that Brexit was basically fostered by a cabal of Russian subversives who are had this kind of unseemly alliance with billionaires and right-wing populists to kind of upend the international order in a way that Trump is also operating. So if you desire to portray Trump as an illegitimate phenomenon, then you're going to latch onto all these kind of extraneous explanations for what he represents. And I think that is a danger because it leads you to, again, depict present political circumstances as though there's nothing precedented about them, when, in fact, a lot of the worst things that, in my opinion, Trump has done are actually continuations of the status quo, also, albeit with a Trumpian flair, and done in a way that is kind of most identified with his ridiculous rhetoric and his ridiculous mannerisms, and that's what people latch onto, but is actually a longstanding feature of the American state. I can give a couple examples, one of which is bombing Syria. I mean, he's done that twice now. And to me, bombing a foreign country without sufficient pretext is one of the worst things that an American president can do. And
that's as American as apple pie, I would say.
It's an American apple pie, and it's actually one of the very few occasions where the media was virtually united in praising Trump. So they don't care when he, illegally bombs countries, but they do care when he cracks a rude joke or when he, makes a ambiguous facial expression at Putin. And there are other examples as well. I mean, so Trump is appointing Supreme Court justices who are basically just creatures of the conservative legal establishment, and who Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or any other of these guys would have very easily nominated. In fact, you can make a strong argument that Trump nominating these guys is basically a capitulation to the conservative establishment that he upended and had a mandate to actually rebuke. But because he apparently doesn't care about the ideological character of Supreme Court justices, means he's just willing to outsource that to an institution which, again, is very much precedented in American society. So the basic takeaway is that the worst aspects of Trump's presidency, by my lights, are those in which he's basically carrying forth the establishmentarian status quo. And yet those are the aspects of his presidency which don't seem to upset the, quote, resistance quite as much as, I would say, the more trivial facets of what he's done, such as going to Brussels last week, doing some deal-making theatrics, saying to Angela Merkel, "You're enthralled to Germany," to Russia. This was all supposedly a harbinger of the collapse of the international order. Well, lo and behold, the international order is still as it was prior to, a week and a half ago. I mean, I don't think that should be a surprise. And Trump actually ended up entrenching NATO by at least claiming or getting NATO member states to reaffirm their commitment to NATO and to reaffirm their commitment to allocating more of their GDP toward defense spending. So Trump didn't cause the international Western security order to implode. That's what a lot of the most prominent analysts in American media claimed was happening. But what actually happened was that Trump proved that even somebody with his very intemperate style can go to NATO and end up solidifying its status as a vaunted international institution. So one dynamic that I've been observing, which is actually really interesting, is that Trump's supporters want to believe that he's a greater change agent than he really is, that he's this bulwark against globalism, that he is, taking on the deep state, that he's changing the face of American politics forever, and for that matter, the international system. And then you have his opponents basically making a similar claim, but with a different twist, saying that Trump is such an enormous threat that look what he's doing. He's causing these decade-old post-war alliances to crumble. He is, by imposing some tariffs, giving a death blow to the international trade system. He is basically just destroying democracy both in America and the world over. I mean, both these interpretations of Trump are very extreme in terms of their rhetoric, but neither have much resemblance to reality. And that's sort of the kind of blinkered atmosphere that we're operating within. You have both his supporters and their opponents attributing to Trump much more than what Trump actually is, which is somebody who's maybe tinkered with elements of the status quo, but the way in which he is a big departure from the status quo is almost entirely in terms of his rhetoric. And ultimately, rhetoric doesn't have a whole lot of effect on how politics or the international system is constructed, because you can rattle off all the rhetoric that you want, but if it doesn't translate into action, then the impact that you have is only going to be fleeting.
Okay, so there's a lot there, obviously. Let me see if I can respond to as much as I remember. So this is not normal. So this is like the standard liberal phrase that gets tweeted out whenever Trump does something, and then it's often mocked by leftists on Twitter who think that this is absurd. So some of the things. So Trump himself is not normal. Like, he's not a normal human being. He's a very strange human being. He's strange as a politician. He's strange as a business executive. He's strange as a president. The last president who had no previous political experience before ascending to the office was Dwight Eisenhower. He won World War II in Europe, so a kind of bigger accomplishment than building buildings and owning golf courses. And then, like, you go back, there's no previous person who became president who never had military or political experience in the past. So he doesn't really know what the hell he's doing. Like, I think that's kind of clear. This is my own, like, somewhat weird interpretation of him. He's not normal in that he doesn't care about politics. He obviously doesn't care about policy. He cares about politics in the way that a 72-year-old man who watches Fox News every day cares about politics, but he doesn't really care what happens. He wants to win. He wants people to pay attention to him. He likes going to rallies. He likes being on TV. He likes talking to his favorite talk show hosts on Fox and Friends and Sean Hannity. I'm sure he likes the fact that he gets to live in the White House and fly on the big plane, and everyone pays attention to him. So this is all great, but he doesn't really have political objectives that he cares about in the way that previous holders of the office had. So you pointed out his two nominations to the Supreme Court were basically down the line conservatives from the Federalist Society who Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz could have just as easily appointed. Like, whereas you could imagine if Trump was like the disruptive figure that he seemed like he could have been in 2016, he could have like appointed more of like a maverick figure to the Supreme Court who would have like upheld his unusual like coalition's politics. But he didn't do that. He just appointed these people. I think honestly he probably mainly appointed them because they're both like handsome looking men who look like the kind of person who should be Supreme Court judges. Like he places a lot of emphasis on being straight out of central casting, and like Gorsuch especially is like this striking looking guy, and he's tall and blah blah blah. So we can't imagine Trump like poring over legal decisions and thinking like who is truly the best jurist. He just like they gave him a book. It had 4 names in it. He met with the people. He picked the one he liked the most. Like that's it. Trump doesn't care about Roe versus Wade. He doesn't care about affirmative action. I think there's a few things he does care about. One is he doesn't like foreigners, or at least dark-skinned foreigners. Obviously, he married 2 of his 3 wives are from Europe, but he really doesn't like dark-skinned foreigners. So he cares about immigration for that reason. He obviously cares about trade, but I think his main foreign policy idea is someone else is eating our lunch. We're getting screwed. Can you believe it? People dug up old interviews where he talked about Japan in the same exact way he talks about China today. So he's, a skeptic of free trade and a skeptic of all like anything happening in another country. But what he does like is he likes authoritarian leaders, and he clearly has an affinity for people like Putin and Erdogan and Lil Kim and Duterte, because I feel like this is like he wishes he could be in that kind of position where like everyone truly did have to treat him like the number one guy who can do everything he wants to do. So everything other than that is just his wins, etc. Okay, go ahead.
Let me just interject there. I mean, I think so. This is another dominant narrative now that you hear every single day. Trump has an affinity for authoritarian leaders, which may well be true. He may have an affinity for those particular leaders that you mentioned. But if you go in and look at his comments about, say, Justin Trudeau over time, about Macron, about even Theresa May, about other foreign leaders who visit the White House, and so it's not a huge deal if like the leader of Sweden comes to the White House and he has a nice press conference with Trump. Those flattering comments that they exchange don't tend to get reported because they don't fit into a preordained narrative. The point is that you mentioned that Trump is sort of devoid of ideology to an extent that's unusual for a president. I would agree with that. He has a bundle of instincts that he's attempted to channel. And when he doesn't care about an issue, he basically outsources it to the kind of administrators who have basically have long ties to the Republican Party, who he had to rely on in order to create a government, because it's not like there was this roster of quote unquote Trumpists available for him to staff the enormous enterprise, which is the federal government. So the Republicans who, were provisioned by years and years of conservative think tanks and legal societies and so forth, they filled the void. But if Trump is devoid of ideology, then why would he have any particular attachment to like a Duterte or Putin? I think he's he's drawn to people who flatter him and who say nice things about him. And if a socialist said a nice thing about him, he'd probably, be willing to go and praise that person as well, because he doesn't care all that much. He wants himself elevated.
Yeah, I agree. So if a foreign leader comes to the White House, obviously they flatter. It's flattering to Trump. He gets to do the handshake with the press there, whatever private meeting they have. I'm sure the Prime Minister of Norway is saying admiring things about Trump and the United States, and that makes Trump feel good. So I agree about that. Whenever there's some sort of disagreement, that's when Trump starts insulting the person personally. So it seems like Macron originally was kissing his ass, and they had this, they brought Trump to the Bastille Day parade or whatever, and Trump loves that. Because he loves parades. That's like a long-standing thing in his life, is that he really loves parades. Before he was elected president, he said the proudest moment of his life was when he was chosen to be the
Grand Marshal of the Israeli.
Yes, the honorary Grand Marshal of the Israeli Day Parade, which is not even. I never even heard of his. I'm Jewish. I never even heard of Israeli Day before or something. It's total bullshit. This is his proudest life achievement, that he got to lead a parade, and that's essentially what he wants to do. He wants to lead the American parade, and he's having his Pentagon set up this military parade at some point in the fall. So yeah, he likes being flattered.
He's the pundit in chief more so than the commander in chief. I mean, that's what he did in order to get So when ordinary presidential candidates want to garner enough support where they're viable within a Republican or Democratic primary, generally what they do is they travel to the early states, New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina. They kind of kowtow to the local officials there. They build up an infrastructure within those states. They go around and seek endorsements. Trump didn't do any of that. He just was a pundit on national media, namely Fox News, and on other kind of, you might be called under media, World Net Daily and stuff. And that was his route. So that is what he basically, it seems as though he sought the presidency in order to achieve, being the most amplified pundit in the world.
Yeah, he guarantees that he's on TV every day. I mean, one thing, so I've said a lot of things denigrating Mr. Trump. One thing he definitely knows a lot about and has an seemingly instinctual feel for is television, reality TV, how to get the media to pay attention to him. So that's a lot more important than I think a lot of us realized, before he launched his presidential campaign, that the skills of a reality TV star are important. But I should also note that reality TV created him in his current state because he was a middling, real estate executive. He wasn't even one of the most powerful real estate executives in New York City when The Apprentice created this myth of him as a globe-striding business colossus. And that show was on the air for 10 or 15 years. And without The Apprentice, there's no way he could ever become president.
But this is why I think that the narrative that you kind of hinted at, which is that he has this strange affinity with authoritarian leaders, and he wants to create a new alliance system that rebukes the traditional American allies such as, France and the UK and Canada in favor of this dark, sinister alliance.
I'm not saying that. That gives him too much credence for forward planning. He just likes people who are thuggish.
But that's the narrative that's very predominant, right? I mean, no, he likes people who flatter him and who say nice things to him.
He likes tough guys. There's a quote from him from an interview in the 80s where he's praising the Chinese crackdown at Tiananmen Square for using force. And he's like, they were very strong. They used force. It was a tough situation, but they did what they had to do. So he has these very masculine ideals about toughness in leaders, and you do what you got to do. It may not be pretty, but you do what you got to do and keep everyone in line. So he likes that. So he has an authoritarian personality. I wouldn't want to be his child, and we can see how his children came out. But he is not he's a wannabe authoritarian, but he's too stupid, and the American constitutional system prevents him from being an actual authoritarian.
Yeah, I want to kind of pause at this point and observe that we spent the last 8 minutes trying to dissect Trump's inner psyche. And while Trump is the president, and that requires some dissection of the psyche, whether we like it or not, I don't think that the public has been well served by this never-ending tendency to put Trump on the psychiatrist's chair and try to extrapolate motives based on aspects of his personality that we can glean through the TV or through reporting or through his tweets. I think that mode of interpretation has become so dominant that it's really had a distortive effect, which is why, although like anybody else, I have to engage in it to some extent, I try to be aware of the deleterious effects of doing that constantly and push back on that where possible, because I don't think that, it's never going to be especially fruitful to come up with some explanation for Trump's actions that we can connect conclusively to whatever his psychological instincts are. I mean, I remember on the right, under the 8 years of Obama, this was a constant mode of interpretation as well. We want to be able to trace Obama's actions back to his kind of psychological aversion to America, the fact that he is
anti-colonialist mindset.
Yeah, the Kenyan anti-colonialist mindset, which was D'Souza and Gingrich and all those people who, somehow wrote best-selling books based on expounding that thesis. And they would always use that as kind of an analytical shortcut to characterize something Obama had done. He has this burning antipathy for America. It's based on his childhood or based on the fact that he was in Indonesia for a couple years and so on and so forth. And did anybody really find that to be a beneficial use of time other than to kind of galvanize people who are already kind of angry at Obama into purchasing products? I don't particularly think so. I mean, again, it's sort of unavoidable to some degree. And Trump is such an outsized personality that you can't help but try to wonder whether this particular action is attributable to this particular psychological motivation. But again, it's a superficial analytical mode. And I wish people would be more aware of that. And if anything, it's a confirmation that Trump is actually much more shrewd than we might have thought, because everybody spends so much time on this issue of his psyche rather than analyzing the things that he's actually done. And that was, I think, a product of his reality TV tenure. All that was about what will Trump do based on these kind of hints as to his inner motivations that he drops over the course of an hour-long show, and wants you to stick around for the commercial break in order to find out. So I think you're almost giving into that framing when you allow yourself to be mired in this, ceaseless discussion of Trump's instincts.
Let me reply to that. I mean, you raise a good point about, kind of like the highbrow version of this is like the Maureen Dowd column that's like always psychoanalyzing the president, and she wrote 100 columns about George W. Bush's father issues, and that's why he went into Iraq too, because George H.W. Bush didn't do the job there, and Bill Clinton's libido, and Obama's like cool demeanor and absent father. So this is like a staple of punditry. It's usually like mostly bullshit and overdone. It points to the outsize and kind of gross importance of the presidency in our lives, that we have to like deal with this fucking person for 4 to 8 years and have to care about their family, and we call them the first family, and Melania is the first wife, like she's the first wife. Like, what the fuck is first lady? What does that mean? It's fucking stupid. So like if after 4 or 8 years, like the office of the presidency is diminished because of Donald Trump's like grossness and stupidity, then that will probably be a good thing. But Trump doesn't have an ideology. All the previous Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama all had ideologies. Trump does not have an ideology. He doesn't care. He just cares about these things I mentioned previously: being flattered, being adored, getting on TV. So his bizarre psychology matters more than it did for any previous occupant of the office who had like actual things they wanted to accomplish, when Trump doesn't really care. I mean, Trump's big thing in 2016 was building the wall. Where's the wall? The wall has not been built. You think he would have devoted more time to building the wall when that was like his signature thing, but he seems not to care about it at all. And if you follow people like Blogging Heads co-founder Mickey Kaus, who are very devoted to immigration restrictionism, you'll see that they are not happy with Trump because he has not lived up to his promises, and the wall has not been built, and the wall is not going to be built and will never be built because Trump doesn't care.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perhaps true that the psychoanalysis stuff is more important with Trump because he's kind of has less ideological content than previous presidents. But, thinking back to previous presidents, a number of them ran on the strength of them shunning ideology, or at least that they claim that they shunned ideology. So with Obama was there are no red states and no blue states. We need a practical form of politics which can appeal to Republicans. We need to be above the fray. Even George W. Bush, when he first ran in 2000, was hailed as a Republican governor who could get along with Democrats and was willing to do bipartisan policy solutions. And, before 9/11, he actually did some of that, like No Child Left Behind. Bill Clinton shunned ideology as a, quote, new Democrat and, incorporated pieces of basically kind of classically right-wing politics in order to expand his appeal. And I think you could find examples of that going back throughout history. So that wouldn't be that unusual for a successful politician to at least claim as though that they are above ideology. Maybe even it's a prerequisite to being successful. Now, Trump, you're right, is different in the sense that he had no elected office experience. He simply ran golf courses and appeared on television, which is makes it a lot more difficult to decipher what his instincts are politically. But I don't know that justifies the wholly disproportionate focus on his psyche. I guess, yes, you may need some of it, given how scant his record was prior to 2016. But there's just too much. It's too dominant. It has a distortive effect, and it makes people believe, for example, that this is not normal and that there's no continuity here between Trump's government and previous iterations of American governance, which there very much are. And if you don't recognize that, then you can't actually get to the root causes of what is bringing about the most, repellent excesses of Trump's tenure in office. So I don't believe that the emphasis is warranted, notwithstanding the legitimate points that you've raised and I've raised about how his psyche actually kind of is significant. But you talk about his bundle of instinct, and you kind of went through the litany of issues that he seemed to have some genuine commitment to, whether that be trade, immigration, and foreign policy. One of the issues that I discussed over the course of the 2016 campaign was his instinct with regard to foreign policy, and I observed with a handful of others that Trump seemed to evince some non-interventionist instincts that were bundled together with very aggressive instincts. So he would one day call for bombing the shit out of ISIS, and on the other day say that America's gotten a raw deal in the Middle East, and we need to use that money on infrastructure projects at home. So it was kind of a confluence of contradictory instincts.
But that last one gets back to they're eating our lunch. Like, we got screwed. Like, Iraq screwed us over. We should have taken the oil and gotten out. So I think that part fits into his whole, they're eating our lunch idea.
It does. He's also, made comments about how horrible it was that Iraqi civilians got bombed. And again, it's always a mishmash of jumbled emotions and instincts with him, which is why all you can really do, at least prior to his assuming office, was try to discern instincts. And, I got a huge amount of pushback for observing that one of these instincts was non-interventionism, as if that meant that Trump was a, quote, peace candidate, or that he wanted to, send roses and teddy bears to foreign countries instead of bombs. No, that was never the point. The point was that one of his instincts that is in contradiction to others, but is still evident in his psyche, I guess, is this non-interventionism. And obviously, and you can't say this now, but that instinct has actually been manifest more in the past couple months than maybe at any other point in his presidency. The North Korea summit being one huge example. I mean, it would have been total blasphemy for a president of any party, 2 years ago to say, I'm going to meet without preconditions with the leader of North Korea. I mean, that would not have even been recognized as a fathomable possibility.
I agree.
And yet Trump did it. He was denounced for not getting enough in return and not being antagonistic enough toward Kim. He was basically criticized on interventionist grounds, or on kind of conventional militaristic grounds, for the tack that he took with North Korea. And so for him to have done that, I think probably reflects some genuine instinct that he does have with regard to how foreign policy ought to be conducted. Now, you have to take that in concert with other actions that he's taken, such as increasing bombing against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which has created huge amounts of civilian casualties, carrying forth the Obama-Bush legacy of drone strikes and special ops, which has a huge humanitarian impact. Continuing to abet the Saudi incursion into Yemen. So nobody's saying that he is a pure-hearted anti-interventionist. Nobody ever said that. But just as Obama evinced some characteristics that led one to believe that he had interventionist views, so does Trump. And one example of that would seem to be this North Korea issue, and even his press conference this week with Putin, which has caused another meltdown. Just as a side note, I don't know how many meltdowns that the American public can be subjected to by their media and still kind of remain sane. Mm-hmm. I mean, last week it was the Western security order was collapsing. This week is where the president is a traitor. I mean, next week it's going to be, I don't know, there's an asteroid heading to Earth that somehow Trump commandeered. It's just too much.
It'll be a blessed relief at this point.
It's too much, maybe. It's just too much for the average person to process. So I almost feel like they're being fatigued and they're tuning stuff out because the hyperbolic rhetoric has diminishing returns, and those returns probably diminished a long time ago to the point where they're no longer have any kind of meaning. But even at this press conference, Trump carried forth the longstanding American tradition of at least attempting to achieve some kind of détente with the Russian or Soviet leader, notwithstanding fraught relations and notwithstanding with whatever geopolitical tensions might be present. And that, I think, is also an indication of some, what you might call a non-interventionist instinct. Now, if Trump had gone to Helsinki, denounced Putin to his face, announced some kind of aggressive posture toward him, and then launched some bombs or sent more arms to a nation state on Russia's borders, or done something that proved how belligerent he was toward Russia, he would have been cheered, but that would have not been consistent with a non-interventionist outlook. And so I think when you're talking about instincts, that I feel has been ignored because the mainstream narrative has been inverted to the point where Trump receives the most criticism when he does something which is actually a departure from mainstream establishment norms, at least with regard to national security or to foreign policy. So he got a huge amount of criticism for coddling a dictator with Kim in North Korea, and he's getting the same criticism now with respect to Putin, even though one of the reasons that Barack Obama defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2008 Democratic primary was because he said that he'd be willing to meet with foreign leaders, even hostile foreign leaders, without preconditions. Hillary said she wouldn't do that, and that was a big reason why Hillary lost, arguably, because that in addition to her foreign policy record more broadly. So, I mean, I think people kind of pick and choose what instincts they want to emphasize with Trump because he's just so much in our daily lives, and we can't get beyond him. That it's very possible to weave a narrative, weave a whole variety of narratives using kind of the bits and pieces of his psyche that he leaves for us to kind of contemplate. Okay,
so once again, there's a lot there. So on the outrage cycle and the sense that the world is ending every day because of something Trump did, I would encourage people to subscribe to the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which is a project that Robert Wright is leading. I'm working on it as well. It's currently in I'm
a subscriber.
Okay, great. It's on the summer hiatus. We'll be coming back in a little bit, but yeah, the goal of that is to try to cut through the outrage, bloviation, things that are supposed to get your emotions roiling, and point out what actually matters and what are the actual mindful ways to resist Trump. So there's the plug. On Trump's foreign policy, I mean, At one point in 2016, Glenn Greenwald tweeted that Trump had a non-interventionist mindset, and I've been jokingly retweeting that line whenever Trump does something aggressive in the world. I don't think he has any mindset whatsoever, aside from what I said previously. So he obviously likes Americans more than other countries, and he would never send troops into Iraq to bring freedom and democracy because he doesn't care about people in Iraq at all, and doesn't particularly care about freedom and democracy either. In his dealings with other world leaders, I mean, it's true that had Hillary Clinton gone to meet with Kim Jong-un, she probably would have been impeached. And it's hard to see any other Republican doing it as well. It seems to be a good thing that Americans and North Koreans are talking, and North Korea claims to want to disarm. I don't trust anything that Trump himself may have gotten out of Kim, because Trump is a moron and Kim is smarter than him. And I'm highly skeptical of the entire affair, but better to talk than not to talk. Why don't we segue into talking about the Russia stuff, because you mentioned the press conference. I mean, it's so, this is not normal. So it's not normal for a Republican politician to go and kiss the ass of Vladimir Putin. Like, Ted Cruz would not have done that. So Trump has his own things going on there. What is actually going on is the major story and psychodrama of our age, I suppose. And you've been a big critic of the Russia hysteria. And there's this information comes out in drips and drabs. There were indictments last week. There was a woman who apparently was a Russian gun rights advocate who was arrested for being a Russian agent in Washington, D.C., and she got her photograph taken with a dozen of the ugly old white men who populate the GOP over the past couple of years, and those photos have been popping up online, although apparently she did not access the Oval Office. That photo was tweeted in error. That was just another woman with red hair in the Oval Office when the Russian delegation was visiting with Trump. There's something weird going on here, but I have no idea what it is. So there's obviously the idea about the P-tape. That seems outlandish to me for multiple reasons. There's Jonathan Chait's idea put forth in a recent New York Magazine piece that possibly Trump has been some kind of Russian mole since 1987 when he visited the Soviet Union trying to start a hotel there. And when he came back, he started denouncing NATO or something. This also seems pretty far-fetched. But then there's also just a lot of weird shit. Why does Trump seem to care about Putin so much when he clearly doesn't care about other people almost at all? Why was he so solicitous of Putin? The most, I think, innocent explanation is that he's very psychologically attached to the idea that he won in 2016 fair and square, and any intimation that Putin, intervened in the election in some way would undermine his great election, his great victory in the Electoral College, which is very biased against Republicans, we all know, and he won 305 electoral votes, blah blah blah. So he can't admit to any collusion because it would hurt his fragile little ego. That makes a kind of sense to me because he's such a fucked up person. Then there's the idea that I think is most likely true, which is that over the years, as a semi-crooked and shitty business real estate executive, his company helped launder money from Russian oligarchs through construction of places like Trump Soho in New York City and his other crappy buildings around the world. So a lot of, fishy people use high-priced American and Canadian real estate to stash their money overseas. Would Trump have any objection to this happening if he was building the building? I can't see how he possibly would. So there's some chance that there's some illegal activity here that the Russians know about, and they are holding over Trump for some reason. Did Russia try to affect the 2016 election? It seems pretty clear to me that at this point that they did. Was that what mattered? I mean, there were 100 things that mattered. It mattered that Hillary Clinton was the worst politician in America. It mattered that she said the word deplorables. It mattered that she fainted at the 9/11 ceremony. There's there's just a series of like 100 events, like any one of which didn't happen. Like if she had hired a competent campaign team who had told her to focus on the swing states in the upper Midwest, she probably would have won. So I don't think it's the determinative factor, but it seems to have played some small role along with the other like 100 things that led us to this bizarre set of circumstances. Okay, so that's what I'd say about that.
Well, this is going to be deeply disappointing to people who stand out on the street corner screaming this is not normal every day. But unfortunately, it is quite normal for the American president to meet with the Russian or Soviet leader and to say solicitous things of that leader, and for those two people to be mutually flattering of one another. I can give you many, many examples of Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush. Go back down the line. Even in the most fraught of circumstances, when the two countries were on the brink of nuclear annihilation, even when the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, or when the U.S. had shot down an airliner or something, even when there was an international crisis, nevertheless, the two leaders got together and, as a matter of just normal statecraft, said nice things about one another. So now Trump has his own mannerisms, as we've already discussed. He has his own quirky style. Quirky is maybe a generous way to put it, but he's carrying forth that tradition with Putin. Okay, and people want to assign the most nefarious possible motivations for why he has done that, rather than acknowledge that it's, for better or worse, how American and Russian/Soviet leaders just always operate. So I don't think that it's anything particularly abnormal. Again, what's abnormal is Trump's personal style. And people have to get beyond their obsession with Trump's personal style if they want a clear-headed view of what the actual political/international circumstances are. And that's why I said earlier that I think that the emphasis on his psyche is producing this kind of warped effect where people can't view things with any semblance of objectivity anymore. It's really, really damaging. So if you look at what Trump actually said with regard to Putin, for one thing, Putin actually criticized Trump. This was not acknowledged very much, but Putin reaffirmed his commitment to the Iran deal in that press conference because Barack Obama made solicitous overtures to Vladimir Putin personally in order so that they could work together on a mutual diplomatic objective, which was to achieve the Iran deal. For some reason, Barack Obama wasn't a stooge of Putin when he worked with Putin directly to achieve major diplomatic initiatives. So Putin actually criticized Trump on that ground and restated his commitment to the Iran nuclear deal. I haven't heard a whole lot of coverage of that, but if you actually listen to the press conference, which I did, you will find that that's one of the main things that Putin discussed. So again, this is all about the power of narrative. You could easily construct a narrative based on that statement from Putin, based on the fact that Trump has taken a whole variety of actions that are very much averse to Putin's interests, such as, like I mentioned before, repeatedly bombing his client state, sending lethal arms to Iran, expelling huge numbers of American diplomats, of Russian diplomats from America, of appointing virulent anti-Russia hawks to major positions in his cabinet, such as John Bolton and Pompeo. And yet, that narrative is not what's constructed. What's constructed is this espionage thriller, which is like a boondoggle for journalists, because every single day it provides new snippets of information that seem as though they're bombshell and that they will alter the course of history, but within like 24 to 48 hours end up getting lost in the haze. And that's been the function of this Russia story from the outset. It's so boundless, meaning the boundaries of it are so expansive and so ill-defined that the story just keeps morphing into new areas, and it all seems to come back to this original premise that Trump and Russia engaged in this surreptitious plot to, destroy the world order. I mean, so it's the stakes of it seem pretty dire when you put it in that kind of context, and that's why journalists and Democratic politicians feel as though they're on the cusp of history when they discuss this issue, and that's why they they imbue like stuff like Russian-produced memes and Twitter bots with world historic importance, which I think would have been comical 2 years ago if you had described it to somebody, but today passes as just kind of conventional wisdom, which is sort of amazing. As to kind of like the basic premise of what actually is at the source of this so-called weird activity, well, as I said, I don't think a whole lot of the activity is actually weird. I mean, George W. Bush feted Putin at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, because they had mutual diplomatic objectives that they wanted to pursue with regard to counterterrorism and stuff like that. I don't think Trump would get away with, bringing Putin to, Mar-a-Lago and golfing. So he actually has less room to be solicitous of Putin than previous.
Okay, that was like in 2001 or before the annexation of Crimea and other possible other bad deeds done by.
Well,
President Putin.
Yesterday I tweeted a quote of Obama saying how impressed he was by Putin's contributions to the Russian people less than a year after the South Ossetia conflict, which was declared by American media in large part as an act of Russian aggression, in which McCain, when he was running against Obama, basically said should be the impetus for like World War III.
He said we're all Georgians now.
We're all Georgians now, right? So less than a year after that, Obama was willing to go on the world stage and praise Putin. So I mean, it's not uncommon for this to be the case. And so the indictments this past week were, after a year plus of the Mueller investigation, the first time in which the core elements of the Russia collusion thesis were actually the first time that the Mueller investigation bore on the core thesis of the Russia collusion story. And because remember, it all originated with the hack of John Podesta, so-called hack of John Podesta's email account. So we're now in the throes of a international crisis because John Podesta clicked on a suspicious link in his Gmail. Now, I think it's worth kind of reiterating it in those terms because you have Democrats calling this an attack on America, likening it to 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, saying that it is evidence of Trump's treasonous activity. And it really amounts to one day in March of 2016, John Podesta logged onto his email account and clicked on a suspicious link. I think people need to be aware of that. And how kind of comical that sounds when you kind of step back. But nonetheless, the indictment did bear on that incident, meaning Podesta getting spearphished and the Democratic National Committee getting their emails exfiltrated as well. And I think, it's an indictment. It's plausible, but it's not proven. And until it's proven, I don't think it is prudent to operate under the assumption that what was outlined in that indictment is objective fact. That said, let's say it is objective fact. I keep going back to this point because I think it gets lost with the attack on America rhetoric. What were the fruits of that so-called Russian interference? Well, John Podesta and the DNC had their emails hacked. Okay, fine. What happened as a result of that? Well, the Democratic National Committee's executive board had to resign in disgrace because emails came out showing that they were plotting anti-Semitic smears against Bernie Sanders. It also demonstrated that the DNC was basically merging operations with the Hillary Clinton campaign well before Hillary Clinton had secured the nomination, in direct contravention of their public assurances that they would be a steadfastly neutral body. So they didn't just tilt the scales in a figurative sense. They literally merged operations with the Hillary Clinton campaign. It revealed that they were planning on giving concessions to the Bernie Sanders supporters that were basically bogus because they wanted Bernie Sanders supporters to back Hillary Clinton. It revealed that now on the Podesta emails, what did those reveal? Well, remember when Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders had a debate in the Democratic primary and Bernie Sanders challenged Hillary Clinton to release the transcripts of her speeches to Wall Street, and she said that she would, quote, look into it. And I guess after months and months of looking into it, she still didn't come up with a solution. But when John Podesta's Gmail account was leaked, so lo and behold, those speech transcripts did come out, and they revealed, as expected, that Hillary went before these banks and flattered them and, advanced all her hawkish foreign policy proposals. Those emails also revealed that there was malfeasance within the Clinton Foundation, that the Clinton Foundation's own employees had basically raised. It revealed that the State Department and the Clinton Foundation had merged operations in terms of personnel in direct contravention of what the Clintons had said would be the case. It revealed that Bill Clinton had taken unsolicited donations to the Clinton Foundation from foreign tyrannical regimes, despite an agreement that Hillary had reached with the Obama administration that they wouldn't take such donations. It revealed that Donna Brazile tried to give debate questions to Hillary Clinton so that she could have an upper hand against Bernie Sanders. The list goes on and on and on in terms of the genuinely revelatory information that came out as a result of those so-called hacks that the American public deserved to know. And so, let's just stipulate that it was the Russian GRU responsible for that. It may sound bizarre to put it this way, but the Russian GRU kind of did a public service. Maybe.
Okay, so you agree with Trump about that? It's that.
Well, I don't care what Trump says. I'm saying that if you look at the products of that hack, there's a reason why every major media institution in the country covered voluminously those emails. It wasn't because they thought that they were going to be abetting a foreign espionage plot. It was because those emails revealed information that it was in the public interest to report on. So I think this retrospective characterization of it as strictly an attack on America is not just hyperbolic. It's a distortion of what that incident actually was. It was emails being released from the most powerful political figures in the United States. And the reason why people were so upset about it was because it seemed asymmetrical. There were no, concomitant attacks on Trump or the Republicans, and their emails weren't released. Well, okay, if they had been attacked, I would have been in favor of their emails coming out too. But the fact that it was asymmetrical doesn't diminish the significance of what those emails contained. And I think people are just ignoring that basic reality because they're so whipped up into this furor about attack on America and Pearl Harbor and 9/11 and the international order collapsing. And they, can't remember something as recently as a year and a half ago when, all the major media institutions reported on the contents of those emails. And I don't tend to think that it's a particularly good strategy to declare all major American media institutions as the unwitting agents of a foreign espionage plot, because what they were doing was reporting on newsworthy information about the country's most powerful political officials. And I'm going to keep repeating that, whether people like it or not, because that is the reality of what transpired in 2016. Okay,
well here's a different perspective on that. So were the media unwitting dupes? Well, the information is on a public website. Like, they're going to report on it. Like, that's obvious. Throw your mind back to 2016, 2015. There were two email stories. There were Hillary Clinton's emails on her private server in her basement, and then there were the hacked emails. These got conflated in the public mind. So Hillary Clinton private server reinforces everything bad that people think about Hillary Clinton. She thinks she's above the law. She does whatever she wants. She doesn't follow the rules. She's kind of shady. She always slips out of things. Okay. Then the emails, then the hacked emails came out. You listed all of the nefarious deeds of the shitty Democratic Party that came out. It seems like it would mainly piss off Bernie Sanders supporters, what they revealed. They they leak them day by day or something, or like every other day there was a new batch of emails. Like, that was a smart way to do it. Emails were in the news constantly throughout like summer and fall 2016. We're always hearing about emails. What's the latest revelation from the emails? So some of them are kind of bad. Some of them are like, well, I don't know. I mean, kind of shitty. Like Donna Brazile gave one question to Hillary. Like, does that really help anything if you actually think about it? Like, one question out of 17 debates, like, no. But it sounds bad. Like, it sounds like the Democrats are corrupt. But most people don't pay attention to the news. But most people are not like digging through John Podesta's emails. And we should know for a second that one real-world effect of John Podesta's emails being leaked was the creation of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, which has metamorphosed into the QAnon conspiracy theory, which I actually recorded a conversation with Will Sommer from the Daily Beast about just yesterday, which will appear, this maybe already appeared on Blogging Heads by the time you see this, or will soon. So, yeah, so that's just the side note of how crazy our country is. Yeah, so it was emails. And what did emails meant? Hillary Clinton, slippery, crooked, can't trust her. That was the reinforcement. So it was about the narrative. I know you've been disputing narratives that get created by the press and by politicians and saying, they mask underlying reality. Well, is Hillary Clinton actually crooked or not? I mean, she's kind of crooked. Like her and Bill Clinton have done a number of slippery things throughout the years. Bill more than Hillary, but there was some shady shit that they did, and that wasn't good. Are we comparing crooked Hillary to crooked Donald? There's a lot more shady shit that Donald Trump has pulled over his years as a real estate magnate in New York City, I'm sure, than whatever Hillary Clinton did with the Clinton Foundation or something. But it was the conflation of emails equals Hillary is a crook that really, and the drumbeat of these emails being released constantly, regardless of what was contained in them, because people don't care about that I think was a determining factor in the election.
I think it's probably correct. And I remember observing this at the time, that there was a public conflation of the various email-related so-called scandals that had to do with the Clintons. But I think the reason why there was that public perception was because of Hillary Clinton's own conduct, meaning in direct violation of her own department's standards that she was later denounced for by the Inspector General of the State Department. She set up a private server on which information that was marked classified traversed, and then she proceeded to lie about it constantly and obfuscate the fact that she was under criminal investigation as early as July of 2015. Her supporters in the media and the Democratic Party lied to the public repeatedly and denied that criminal investigation was going on, when we later found out that not only was there a criminal investigation, that it was launched specifically to ascertain whether her conduct personally violated federal criminal statutes. So a lot of that perception that you mentioned that I think is accurate stems from her own conduct. It wasn't because there was a nefarious foreign intervention. Although, yes, when you have lots of stuff about emails coming out and people don't have the time or interest to kind of get to the bottom of every single aspect of what those emails supposedly signify, then yeah, there's going to be a conflation, but there's always a conflation in the public mind when you have a presidential contest. So I assign blame for that problem to the candidate herself, rather than to this idea that Hillary Clinton was wronged and the American public should have been more aware of how generous and public spirited she was. So I don't think that that's necessarily a problem if it reinforced longstanding American beliefs about as you just said, the crookedness of Bill and Hillary Clinton. I mean, that was their own doing, and the Democrats could have nominated a different candidate. I also do think that, one thing that's ironic to me, I guess, just taking a step back, is that I do think that there's a lot of corruption involving Donald Trump, both before and during his presidency, that would be worth focusing on. I think the emoluments stuff is maybe a little bit of a harebrained constitutional theory, although it's gaining traction in court. But whether or not it's a constitutional violation, the fact that he has these unwieldy business interests all over the United States and the world, and that those could be used to potentially influence policy, is a very legitimate issue involving public corruption. And so I can imagine an alternate universe where instead of Russia, instead of email hacks, and instead of weird internet memes, the fact of his having these business interests all over the U.S. where people can, pay money to his hotels or pay money for golf club memberships and thereby exert influence on the president, I can imagine an alternate universe where that was the focal point of a narrative about Trump's abnormality, which actually is fairly abnormal. Rather than, and would be worth, I would stand up and chant, "This is not normal" on the sidewalk if that was the predominant narrative, but it's not, because it's not as sexy as the Trump and Putin collaborated in 1987 or something. Who knows anymore? What the theory supposedly is. Anyway, usually when politicians get exposed for their corruption, my instinct is just to blame the politician himself rather than the entity which made available information revealing that corruption.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you that it would make more sense to go after the Trump administration's and Trump himself's corruption and, Scott Pruitt's crazy, like blatant corruption and trying to use his office to benefit himself that finally forced him to resign, like after a year's worth of corrupt stories. And yeah, I believe that I read that Mar-a-Lago doubled its initiation fee from $250,000 to $500,000 after Trump was elected. So that's a nice
and this goes back. And during the presidential campaign, I remember saying something similar. I remember saying, "Why don't you, Hillary?" Not that I wanted to necessarily give advice to the Hillary Clinton campaign, but I was saying if I were advising them officially, if I were making a killing on advising them and getting way too much more money than I deserved, as most operatives do, I would be advising them: forget about the Putin stooge stuff. Talk about Trump's personal corruption in the sense that he, over the course of his career, bilked small business owners. I remember there was like a maker, like a piano maker or something, that he screwed over in New Jersey in the 80s or so. There were just a tons of stories like that you could elevate and which would actually, cast out some of the mystique of him as this kind of brilliant business mind, which had been implanted in the public consciousness because of his reality TV show. But my advice, my theoretical advice was never taken, but it still stands now. I think you can still find instances in which he's probably, him or his associates or his acolytes are violating the public trust by engaging in what may or may not be emoluments, but whatever you kind of define them as are pretty obvious and egregious instances of public corruption. But for whatever reason, doesn't sell as well as this international espionage plot, which is why I get back to the fundamental belief, which has driven my skepticism on this issue in large part, which is that none of this I'm saying because I feel like Trump should be immune from scrutiny. Rather, it's the total opposite. It's that I feel like the never-ending saturation of coverage of this issue is actually an impediment to a rational, thoughtful, targeted opposition, which can actually provide a meaningful counterweight to Trump's worst excesses. So you have stuff like Trump being given surveillance powers by Adam Schiff, who's basically the leader of the Russiagate crusade, and nobody really pays it any mind because they don't really care if Trump has these surveillance powers, because again, it's just a long-standing continuation of American state power. But I think it's stuff like that which tells me that this delusion that Trump is this incredible abnormality and is a departure from an American continuity. That's where I think the analysis really falters. So I've always said that the opposition to Trump is going to flail if it's not targeted and rational and responsive to new facts and grounded in a clear-headed interpretation of what the state of play in American politics is. And I don't see that for the most part. And that's why, my perspective has been what it's been.
Okay, I have maybe just one more question. We've gone over an hour.
Yep.
So this entails me trying a slight audio-visual thing here. So I'm holding my phone up to the camera. Can you see what that says?
Yeah, it says, I do not give a fuck about Russia.
Okay, so this is a little meme. I don't know there must be some app that lets people create these. It looks like things from Trapper Keepers in the 1990s. Yes, it says, I do not give a fuck about Russia. The bro pair who is on Twitter, whose real name is Dan O'Sullivan, who's kind of a left Twitter personality, journalist, joke maker guy, tweeted that yesterday, and I thought it was pretty striking. So I follow a lot of left people on Twitter, and noticed pretty consistently, maybe up until very recently, that if you were on the left, you were not buying the whole Russia thing. And it seemed to me, so my diagnosis of this was that the left, which is kind of having at least a small resurgence right now through Bernie Sanders and through the Democratic Socialists of America, saw 2016 as like the final, the American people dismissed and turned against like neoliberal, like democratic neoliberalism, is represented in its apotheosis Hillary Clinton, and and in turn elected like a quasi-fascist or whatever, however you want to call him, like a very bad guy, Donald Trump. The only thing that can truly counter Trumpism is a revived leftism, because liberalism, Hillary Clinton discredited like American mainstream liberalism. And then when the Russia, and this is summed up in the phrase "Bernie would have won," which I agree with. Bernie would have won, and I voted for Bernie in the primary. So the Russia story emerges, and this provides this alternate reason that Hillary Clinton and the democratic version of neoliberalism lost. It was the nefarious foreigner who undermined our sacred values and did it to us. So they've been rejecting the Russia story all along, and I place you more on the left than the liberals. Do you credit this at all? Or is this a misreading?
No, I think it's a fair reading. I think that, again, there's this deep desire to want to believe that Trump was a fraudulent imposition on America rather than a manifestation of a genuine impulse in American society that's been there from probably the beginning. And so they want to content themselves with this explanation which draws on a nefarious foreign subversion plot. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's a similar situation with Brexit. And I think it can be understood as basically the anxieties and paranoia of the liberal class coming to the fore. And they are increasingly disoriented and untethered from reality in a lot of ways, because their station in society is being progressively diminished. They aren't seen as having the authority that they once did. And again, this is a general statement because we're talking about a large swath of the country in terms of their kind of class status. I'm talking about people in the think tank realm, in the elite media realm, and maybe elements of academia, all of whom were virulently opposed to Trump. Remember, Trump didn't receive a single newspaper endorsement in 2016 other than like some obscure town paper in Nebraska and the National Enquirer, I think. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's a pretty remarkable thing even now. And those people, I think, have been flailing now for a year and a half, and they latch on to whatever explanation seems like the most coherent. And like it or not, I don't think the Trump-Russia story is particularly coherent because, as I said earlier, it's totally unwieldy and it's boundless and it keeps expanding and impinging on different areas. But the narrative distillation of it is fairly coherent, and it's easy for people to understand if they only kind of pick up bits and pieces of it on a day-to-day level. And I think that's basically the motivation. But on the other hand, I want to be charitable to the liberals. I can imagine them responding to you and saying, yeah, maybe there's a lot that we have to self-reflect about in terms of why Hillary lost, and maybe she was an avatar of a failed liberal status quo and yada, yada, yada. But look at just the facts. The facts show that Trump probably more than likely colluded with Russia. The facts show that Putin nefariously intervened in the American election because he wants to destroy the world order. And the facts show that Trump has all these weird, ties. And look at the indictments that Mueller's handed down. That's a talking point. You can't call this a witch hunt because look at how many people Mueller is indicted. Well, Mueller is George W. Bush's former FBI director, and who can basically indict anybody. So I don't necessarily look at that as the word of God, but I mean, you can if you want to.
Well, anyway, some people have pled guilty already.
Yeah, they pled guilty, but for like procedural stuff such as lying to the FBI, which anybody can get caught up in. If they're not, if they don't lawyer up immediately, which these guys are too haughty to have done. And, as a side note, I think it's not the worst thing that somebody like Manafort, who 2 years ago was orchestrating the Republican National Convention, is now sitting in jail. It shows that they actually equal justice under the law is sometimes applied. It's rarely applied, but sometimes can be applied even to powerful figures. So, but anyway, a liberal would say, no, it's not this psychological motivation that you're trying to glean about us excusing liberals. It's because we're rational people and we're looking at the facts. Well, I think that what leads to the impression that there's something, quote, there is just a huge volume of facts that constantly barrage people every single day, which maybe are only kind of dubiously connected to one another. But again, because the contours of the Russia story are so broad, you can get just a flood of information about it every single day. And that leads people to believe, somewhat reasonably, they extrapolate from that there's some fundamental maliciousness or malice at the heart of this that is yet to be uncovered, and that does corroborate the kind of underlying Trump-Russia theory that kind of set this off in the first place. And I don't think that's totally irrational for somebody who's not an avid news consumer to conclude. But I, as somebody who am for better or worse, an avid news consumer, I tend to find that when you actually drill down on any one tidbit of information, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny as evidence of what people want to claim it as evidence of. So that's why I've been kind of I think you're right that there are some people on the left who have been just kind of temperamentally skeptical of the Russia story because they think that it's just excuse making. They don't particularly care about Russia. They want the Democratic Party to focus on other issues like bread and butter stuff, whether it be Medicare for all or, minimum wage, that kind of thing. So that's one sentiment on the left. But another, I think, is a smaller cohort of people who actually are immersed in the day-to-day emerging fact pattern of the Russia story and want to emphasize that, whatever the psychological motivations of the Democrats and liberals who are trying to elevate the story, they're also misreading the facts, and they're they're drawing conclusions that are unwarranted. And there's not a whole lot of interest in doing that meaning scrutinizing each individual fact, because it can be very easily construed as pro-Trump, or you're trying to excuse Trump, or you want Trump to be to evade accountability. And which is not the case, but I think there is a genuine need for that kind of in-the-weeds assessment of each individual fact, because if you're somebody on the left who just says, the Russia story doesn't interest me that much, but I'm not – and I don't think it's a politically wise strategy for the Democrats, so I'm not going to I'm not going to get involved in kind of like the micro stories that come out every day. I think there's a need for at least a certain faction of people to do that, because otherwise it creates the impression that, given just the massive volume of stories, that there has to be a vindication of the narrative that's been propounded by the most kind of vocal and extreme interpreters of what Trump Russia supposedly signifies. So that's sort of like where I've tried to what I've tried to do on some level. And, I guess I will be continuing to do that because there's no end in sight, unfortunately. So steel yourselves. The mantra I've been repeating to myself ever since shortly after Trump was elected, it was that things will always get worse. You might think that they're really bad now, but they will only get worse. So just prepare.
Yeah, that reminds me of a tweet from another leftist funny person, Matt Chrisman Cushbaum from Chapo Trap House. He tweeted on Inauguration Day, "This is the stupidest day in America, and every subsequent day will be stupider," right. Which seems to be true. So I guess the final point I'd make is if you believe there's something to the Russia story, you're kind of like believing in a conspiracy theory. There's like all these nefarious actors, and there's all these tentacles of it, and this attractive redheaded woman who was living in Washington D.C. for a couple years.
Look at Jonathan Chait. So Jonathan Chait wrote that cover. It was a cover story for New York Magazine. So it's the kind of story that people sitting in dentist office and like auto repair shops are going to be, maybe not auto repair shops, but you know what I mean, are going to be sitting in waiting rooms reading, and what the main visual aid in that story, which I tweeted out, is this like
crazy,
just crazy. I don't even know what you call it. A mental map. It's like
a diagram of all the possible links of every possible character. Yeah, that looked insane.
It's just incomprehensible. All the little squiggly lines that are drawn. It's kind of a more urbane version of something that Glenn Beck would have done in 2009. So that's what the mainstream opinion is increasingly becoming. If it can get on the cover of New York Magazine and that can be the visual aid, then people don't perceive what they're postulating to be a conspiracy theory. And this is also an interesting dynamic. Yeah. A conspiracy theory is only deemed as such when it percolates from the fringes of society. So obviously, 9/11 was an inside job, was a conspiracy theory. Obama was born in Kenya was a conspiracy theory. And those were only called conspiracy theories because the people who were at the forefront of proclaiming those tended to be on the fringes of society, although Trump and then Trump was perceived as on the fringe, but over time he migrated obviously to more mainstream. But because the Trump-Russia foundational conspiracy theory, think of what Chait says in that article. He doesn't authoritatively claim it, but he says, it's a pretty good likelihood that this started in 1987. So that's when the conspiracy began, over 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it's not deemed a conspiracy theory because it originates in the center. When it originates in mainstream precincts, when it originates in places that seem extreme, then it's not a conspiracy theory. I think back to Saddam colluding with Al-Qaeda. That was not a conspiracy theory because it started with Jeffrey Goldberg in The New Yorker and Dick Cheney. Mm-hmm. But it was a conspiracy theory. And it would have been, but because people people expounded it who had societal prestige, it never got denounced as such. And it's a similar situation now. The crux of what people are alleging with regards to Trump-Russia is a conspiracy theory. Now, sometimes conspiracy theories are true, and you can furnish evidence to support them. But until that point, they are pretty much classic conspiracy theories. And because the political media class lacks self-awareness, a year and a half after they were utterly and wholly repudiated by the American public, they don't see themselves as again furthering conspiratorial sentiments, even though that's essentially what they're doing, and that can have a really damaging impact on the national psyche over time. It can make people kind of desperate for these little dopamine hits of news and information, which seems to validate their conspiratorial preconceptions. And I don't think that's a fruitful mode of doing politics.
Yeah. So I'm somewhat repeating myself in this conversation with Will Summer, but what I said there, and I'll say again here, is there's a psychological benefit that is given to you when you believe in a conspiracy theory, and that's that someone is in control. The 9/11 conspiracy theory people, it somehow made more sense to think that George W. Bush and the government killed 3,000 people as opposed to these 19 foreigners with box cutters managed to kill 3,000 people. Someone's in charge, and maybe they're not exactly looking after us, but at least someone's there, and someone knows what they're doing. Whereas in reality, human life is random, often absurd, doesn't make a ton of sense a lot of the time. Witness the election of Donald Trump, and it somehow, I'm sure there's people who take psychological solace in the idea that Putin placed Donald Trump in the presidency instead of 500 weird little things happened that snowballed and led to Trump being placed in the presidency, which is more likely. At the same time, a lot of stuff has come out. There's been indictments. This is not the same as believing that the UFOs landed in Roswell. And I think we just have to stay tuned. As you mentioned, some conspiracies are real. We had this guy who wrote a book called Conspiracy on blogging. He has an interview with Bob Wright. His name is escaping me right now, but he was writing about the Peter Thiel takedown of Gawker. And the way he describes this was this is a real conspiracy. They conspired for years. They worked behind the scenes. There were people spread. The idea came from some guy who was living in Europe who went to an intermediary who connected him with Thiel, and Thiel was the player who was providing a small amount of funding, but he wasn't the main player for most of it. So it can it can occasionally happen, and governments also do very destructive things when they want to. So I'm agnostic about what's going to come out in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say, agnostic is the right word, but I'm willing for evidence to be provided which can substantiate the grandiose claims that people have made about this issue for now 2 years. I'm skeptical that there is going to be evidence to substantiate those claims, and I think that the fact that those claims have been made have served a political function that doesn't even necessarily require evidence to be furnished at this point. People are already set in their beliefs. I don't think, ironically, that the widespread belief in the American liberal media, so not what right-wingers describe as the liberal media, but like legitimate liberal media like Mother Jones and stuff. I don't think that I don't think, for example, the transformation of Mother Jones into the leading exponent of a Manchurian Candidate plot is necessarily good for liberal people who have a commitment to liberal political objectives, because I don't think it's actually going to diminish Trump's political standing in a meaningful way. Meaning, it's not going to actually reduce his power. It's in a way that I think other forms of targeted opposition might. So that's am I agnostic? I don't know, because I have a little bit of contempt, frankly, for how this whole narrative has worked itself into the public mind. But at the same time, I have to be open to evidence as somebody who is, at least I like to think of myself as a rational individual. And if you're a rational individual, then you have to assess evidence as it comes. But again, I don't think indictments are themselves incontrovertible evidence. They have to be proven in court, and it's very unlikely, it seems, that the Russian intelligence operatives that Mueller indicted are ever going to appear in American court. So maybe that kind of goes to the fact that those indictments were more a political statement and a means of justifying Mueller's role and why he was appointed in the first place, more so than an actual document issued with the expectation that it's going to initiate a real criminal process. So at the same time, so while there is more specific information now as to at least what the government alleges took place with regard to the kind of origin story of the Russia-Trump collusion kind of theory, which is the hack of the emails, I don't think we can go so far as to treat it as though it's infallible, the infallible word of God, which is, I think, how a lot of people in the media have kind of portrayed it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, why don't we've gone an hour and a half, so why don't we end it there? So, Michael, you said you are between positions right now, so probably people can most easily follow you on Twitter.
Yeah, that's generally, unfortunately, that's probably the best way to keep in contact.
Okay, so your Twitter will be linked up below, but for people who are listening to the podcast, what's your Twitter?
It's Tracey, Tracey.
Okay, and I'm ARYEHCW on Twitter. So
your puns are spectacular, by the way. I can't get enough.
Yeah, I alternate between I guess it's maybe 25% sincere political posting and 75% just stupid joke posting. So if that's what you're looking for,
shit posting is I think the technical term.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Michael, for taking the time to come on, and thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. And we'll see you again next time.
Sure. Enjoyed it.